We didn't have this Wi-Fi thing where it was wireless, where we were always connected. We had to dial up. That is, we had to disconnect our phone lines, or kind of use the phone line in order to dial up to get access to the internet. And while you were on the internet, you couldn't make phone calls. You occupied the phone. It was basically your modem, which gave access to the internet, was using your phone line to make a call to the internet, so to speak. And so it was very slow. It was kind of a painful process, and I'd be on the computer for ages, and my mum would be complaining because she wants to use the phone, and we'd have people who want to call us and they can't call through. But see, the internet was such a new thing at the time. It was so hard for people to understand what it is. I mean, my parents particularly, they didn't use technology very much. They didn't have mobile phones or computers or anything like that, so they had no idea about computers and about the internet. So they would ask me things like, "What is this internet thing? I mean, where is it? What do you get? Where do you buy it? Is it a product? I mean, do you get something? I mean, there was nothing I could show them physically for it. I couldn't tell them where you buy it from. I could tell them our internet service provider. We paid money to them as a service. But then she was like, "Well, does it mean the ISP, do they own the internet? Is that why you're paying them?" Well, they don't own the internet, but they provide a service so that I can get access to the internet. And it was really hard to explain to them. They just couldn't understand what the internet was. So I tried to explain it in terms of what the internet can do. So I said, you can send emails, and emails is kind of like, you write letters to people, but it's instantaneous. I said it's kind of like, well, you can chat to people online, and it's sort of like making a phone call, but you're typing out messages. I said you can join, interest clubs, people who have an interest in soccer or something. You can find clubs that you can join. You can all discuss your favourite hobbies and things like that. I said you can go on the internet, you can get news, you can get the weather. It's like reading the newspaper. And I said you can search for information. It's like going to the library. And so when I explained it like that, I mean, there was something familiar about that. They explained that it's like a newspaper, it's like a library, it's like writing letters. There's something familiar about the internet when you explain it like that. Because the internet seems to do things that we already do, but it just does it in a better and a faster way. But because it is so different, even though it does the same things that we already do, it completely changed the way we did those things. Now, if you've been here with us for the last 2 weeks, as we've been looking through the book of Hebrews, you know that we've come across the idea a few times that Jesus is a high priest in the order of Melchizedek. And this idea of a high priest, it's like me trying to explain to my parents what the internet is. The idea of a high priest to the original hearers, that would have been a familiar idea, something that makes sense to them. And yet, to say that Jesus is a high priest in the order of Melchizedek was something that is so extraordinary, so different, that even though it's a high priest, it was something completely new. And so today we're going to learn about what is this Melchizedek, who is he, and how does he make Jesus, his role as a high priest, how does he make it different? So we're going to go back to chapter 7. We're going to start in chapter 7 and we'll work our way through briefly to chapter 10. So chapter 7 verse 1. Who is this Melchizedek guy? Chapter 7 verse 1. This Melchizedek was king of Salem and priest of God Most High. He met Abraham returning from the defeat of the kings and blessed him. And Abraham gave him 1/10 of everything. First, his name means king of righteousness. Then also king of Salem means king of peace. Without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life, like the Son of God, he remains a priest forever. So this Melchizedek person, he's a very mysterious figure in the Bible. He only appears once, in one place in the Bible, and that's in Genesis 14. And in that passage, he only appears for 3 verses. So in the whole Bible, aside from references to Genesis, there's no other references to Melchizedek. Only in 3 verses. Now, the context of Genesis 14, what happened was, at the time, there were 2 coalitions. One coalition of 4 kings or 4 kingdoms coming together, and they form a coalition. Another group of 5 kings come together and they form a coalition. And the 2 coalitions went to war. 4 kings versus 5 kings. And they went to war, they went to fight. And the group of 5 kings, well, they lost. The 5 kings lost to the 4 kings. And so the 4 kings plundered them, took their goods, took their wealth, took the people in their cities, and took them away. Now, part of this group of people and plunder that was taken was Abraham's nephew. Okay, now Abraham's nephew and his household of family and his slaves and so on, they were all taken by these group of 4 kings. Now, when Abraham heard about this, he went to rescue him. He staged a rescue at night time. He stuck him on them, and he had a little army which was managed to successfully rescue his nephew. And so after this whole battle and this thing was finished, then we come to this person Melchizedek. Melchizedek turns up after all the battle's done, and he turns and he blesses Abraham. And Abraham in turn gives Melchizedek a tenth of all the plunder that he got from the battle. All the things that he won from that battle, he gave a tenth of it to Melchizedek. Now that's it. That's all we know about Melchizedek. That's everything we know about Melchizedek. But the writer of Hebrews picks up 3 things about Melchizedek that he wants to highlight for us here in chapter 7. He highlights 3 things. Firstly, his title. His title, he's the king of Salem. Salem meaning peace. It's a Hebrew with peace. So he's the king of peace. And he's the priest of God Most High. And God Most High being a common way to refer to the God of Abraham. So he's a king and a priest. Secondly, it tells us that his name, Melchizedek, means a king of righteousness. And thirdly, it tells us his origins, where he comes from. Well, we don't really know. We don't know his father or mother. There is no genealogy. There is no beginning or end to him. He just turns up and then he disappears. He's never mentioned again in the Bible. Now, the writer of Hebrews, on this last point, I don't know if, when he's saying that Melchizedek has no beginning, no end, no father and mother, I don't know if he's just simply saying, we don't know where he came from, we don't know his origins, or if he's trying to say, hint, this is Melchizedek guy is a bit like God, there's no beginning, no end. We're not quite sure. But what he picks up on, though, is that this Melchizedek sets up a pattern of a king and a priest, and Jesus follows in that kind of pattern. See, Jesus is also a king and a priest. Melchizedek being the king of Salem, the city of Salem eventually becomes the city of Jerusalem, and Jesus is the king of Jerusalem. And so both Melchizedek and Jesus are king and priest of the same God and of the same city. You also see the pattern of how, Melchizedek means king of righteousness. And Jesus, his name doesn't mean righteousness, but he's often referred to as a righteous branch or as the son of righteousness in the Bible. He's the embodiment of God's righteousness. But it's the third aspect of Melchizedek that the author of Hebrews particularly picks up on. Have a look in verse 15. He says, verse 15, what we have said is even more clear if another priest like Melchizedek appears, one who has become a priest, not on the basis of regulation as to his ancestry, but on the basis of the power of an indestructible life. For it is declared, you are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. So the writer of Hebrews wants to highlight for us that Jesus is like Melchizedek, most importantly, in that his priesthood has no end. He is a priest forever. So because Jesus rose from the dead, Hebrews says he has an indestructible life. He's able to keep on being a priest. Well, he's not like the regular priest in Israel. So in verse 23, he compares Jesus to these other priests. Verse 23, now there have been many of those priests since death prevented them from continuing in office. But because Jesus lives forever, he has a permanent priesthood. Therefore, he is able to save completely those who come to God through him, because he always lives to intercede for them. So you look at the 2 types of priests. On the one hand, you've got the regular priests. So the problem with the regular priests was that they died. And not particularly their fault, but that was a limitation for them in their role as a priest. They couldn't keep on doing their jobs. They had to pass on their jobs to other people. And you had to keep on replacing these priests. On the other hand, Jesus was a priest who had a permanent priesthood. He continued to be the priest. Now over in California, in the fire station in California, who has the world's longest burning light bulb? They have a light bulb that's been dubbed the Centennial Light Bulb because it's been used continuously since 1901. So that's over 100 years that this light bulb's been on. It's been off occasionally when there's been blackouts or things like that, but by and large it's been on continuously since 1901. Now I don't know what it's like at your house, but our house, the light bulb, we have light bulbs blowing all the time. Several times a year we have light bulbs going out. There's no way that they would last 100 years. They won't last a year, I don't think. But you see, the manufacturers of light bulbs, they plan it that way. They don't make light bulbs that last for 100 years anymore. They plan it that they would blow, every couple of months or a year or something. Not because they can't make light bulbs last longer. They can actually make light bulbs last very long. But they deliberately make them more fragile. They make them blow more easily so that you would have to buy more light bulbs, so they would have more income, they would have more business. And this whole idea of where they plan things to break down, it's called planned obsolescence. That's what marketing people call it, planned obsolescence. And they do that with your furniture, they do that with your iPhones, they do that with your appliances at home, with your computers, with your clothes. A lot of the things that we buy, they intentionally make it so that they break down, they get worn out, they go out of fashion, they stop working. And so, sometimes you buy something, and after a couple of years, it just stops working one day, and you wonder what happened. But it's because they planned it that way. They planned it so you would go and buy something new. And see, nothing in our world ever lasts. They all break down. They all have a due-by date. They all wear out. They all go out of fashion. But Hebrews tells us that Jesus, he always lives. He will never be obsolete. He will never be replaced by a better model. He will never die. And so because of that, he always lives to be our high priest. And so he's always able to save completely those who come to God through him. But you don't need anybody else. You don't need to turn to anyone else. He's able to save completely everyone who comes to him. So that's the first thing we learn about Jesus in Hebrews. That he's the permanent high priest because he lives forever. The second thing we learn about Jesus as a priest is in chapter 8. Have a look, chapter 8, verse 1. It says, the point of what we're saying is this. We do have such a high priest who sat down at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, and who serves in the sanctuary, the true tabernacle, set up by the Lord, not by man. The sanctuary that he's talking about, or the tabernacle, some of you know, it was a place where the Israelites went to worship God. It was a place where they went to meet God. And this was a place where God would dwell symbolically. That would be where God lived on earth symbolically. And this was where the priests were to serve. They were to serve God and serve God's people in this tabernacle. This tabernacle was a very, very important building in the life of the Israelite community. It was placed at the very center of the community, and everyone else pitched their tents and their houses around this tabernacle. Right? So it was at the very, very center. It was a town center, this tabernacle. And later on, when this tabernacle was converted into a temple, they found the highest hill in the city. Right? In Jerusalem, they got the highest hill, and they built the temple at the very, very top of this hill. So it would be the most prominent building in the whole city. Now, as important as this tabernacle or temple is, of course, God doesn't literally live there. I mean, it was just a symbol of God's dwelling place. But God is living, God dwells, well, he dwells in heaven, of course. The true tabernacle where God lives is in heaven. And the priests and the high priest and the Israelites, they couldn't enter into heaven. They couldn't enter into the true tabernacle. But for Hebrews says that Jesus doesn't enter the tabernacle. He enters the real thing. He enters the true tabernacle. And he is the high priest who serves in the real tabernacle in heaven. See, verse 5 says that the tabernacle on earth was just merely a copy and a shadow of the real thing. It was just a copy of what was in heaven. And as important as the tabernacle was for the Israelites, it was just a copy. It was an imitation. It wasn't the real thing. Now, some of you know that one of my hobbies, or latent hobbies that I don't really do now, but one of my hobbies is martial arts. And I used to do a martial art called Wing Chun. Some of you have seen recent movies that's on this martial art. Well, not so recent now, a couple of years ago. But even if you've never heard of Wing Chun, most of you have heard of Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee started out doing Wing Chun. That was his foundation for his martial art. And you would all know the famous thing about Wing Chun is the wooden dummy. It's this wooden log thing, and they've got different arms sticking out of it. You've seen it in the movies where people kind of practice on it and smack it and stuff. Now, I've got one of these things at home, right? And the idea is that it's meant to imitate an opponent, or someone that you're meant to fight. So the different things sticking out, it's a punch in different directions. It might be a kick. And you're meant to imitate an opponent so you can learn to parry and block it, or how to get around it and fight back and so on. And so it's an imitation. It's not a real opponent. It doesn't move. It doesn't fight back. But it's meant to be an imitation of an opponent so that you could practice. Now, the tabernacle was a bit like this wooden dummy. It was a dummy temple. It wasn't the real thing, because God didn't really live there, but it was just a dummy version, an imitation for practice, for how to worship God. But it wasn't the real thing. So if you look in your Bibles, you know that your Bible is divided into Old Testament and New Testament, the two main sections, Old Testament and New Testament. Now, the word testament, I don't know if you realize, that it's a Latin word which translates the Greek word for covenant. So it's actually the same as saying Old Covenant and New Covenant, Old Testament, New Testament. And see, the tabernacle, the priest, the law, all of that was part of the Old Covenant, the Old Testament. And when Jesus comes, he establishes a new covenant, a New Testament, a covenant that is better, that is something that was promised by the Old Testament prophets long ago, but a covenant that is better, that is more real than the tabernacle. So have a look at what the prophet says in verse 8 there. This is the prophet Jeremiah prophesying. Verse 8, "But God found fault with the people and said, 'The time is coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their forefathers when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt. But they did not remain faithful to my covenant, and I turned away from them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my laws in their minds and write them on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will a man teach his neighbour, nor a man his brother, saying, Know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, for I will forgive their wickedness and remember their sins no more. By calling this covenant new, he has made the first one obsolete, and what is obsolete and aging will soon disappear.'" You see what God is saying there through the prophet Jeremiah? There is an old covenant which is going to become obsolete. This is God's planned obsolescence. There is an old covenant that is aging and will soon disappear, but here is a new covenant that he's brought in. So the old covenant was no good. The tabernacle, the priest, the sacrifice, it was no good because the Israelites couldn't keep their end of the covenant. They couldn't keep their end of the contract. They were not faithful to God. They turned away from God and they didn't keep his laws. But Jesus brings in this new covenant, a newer version that is able to do what the old covenant could not do. And the writer of Hebrews goes on to explain how this prophecy from Jeremiah is fulfilled in Jesus. So this is how things worked in the Old Covenant. So there were lots of rules and regulations about what the tabernacle was to look like, how you were to build it, what the priest would do at different times of the year. And if you were here when we looked through Leviticus, when we looked through Ezekiel, we went through some of that. There were chapters and chapters and chapters and chapters of details of what they were to do into the tabernacle. Everything from the layout of the rooms, the measurements of the table, the colour of the curtain, the number of candles. Everything is very detailed, laid out for how the tabernacle is supposed to work. Everything in the Old Covenant, how is that supposed to work? It's all laid out. And everything was arranged precisely. And you come down to chapter 9, verse 6. Chapter 9, verse 6. When everything had been arranged like this, the priests entered regularly into the outer room to carry on their ministry. But only the high priest entered the inner room, and that only once a year, and never without blood, for which he offered for himself and for the sins of the people had committed in ignorance. The Holy Spirit was showing by this that the way into the most holy place had not yet been disclosed, as long as the first tabernacle was still standing. See, everything in this old covenant worship was a copy of the one in heaven. It was a simulation of the one in heaven. But the constant message in the old covenant, though, in every action, the message was, keep out. Everything about the tabernacle said, keep out. You cannot approach God. You are not worthy. You're a sinner. So keep out. So last year, I had to go to Melbourne for a church thing, for a Methodist church thing. And, you know, as you go through the airport, as you know, you've got to go through the security. And I hate going through the security. Because every time I go through the security thing, I always do something wrong. So I always set up the metal detector. It's usually my belt or my shoes or something. Or I forget to put my hair gel in the liquid thingo. I always forget to... On my keys, there's a little multi-tool, and I always forget to remove it. So there's always something that I forget and do something wrong. I set up the alarm. I get searched, and they look for my bags and everything. And so, you know, I'm at the airport. I'm there early because I know something is always going to go wrong. I'm there early. I get through the security. I've got plenty of time, so I thought, I'll go grab a coffee. I go to the toilet, take my time. Half an hour before I'm into board, I go to the TV screen and have a look to see where my boarding gate is. I'm looking for my flight. I'm looking at the screen. I'm like, I can't find my flight anywhere. I'm double checking. I'm making sure I've got the right boarding pass with the right date. I'm making sure, you know, I'm like, I've got the right number, but it's not there on the screen. I'm looking. I can't find it. And I'm starting to get a bit panicky. So I find the info desk, the service desk, and I asked the guy, I said, look, I've got this flight. Has it been cancelled or something? What's happened? I can't find it on the screen. And he had a look and he said, you're on Qantas. I said, yeah. Well, Qantas has another terminal. So I didn't realise, I've never flown with Qantas. I've always usually fly Jetstar or, Tigers, they're cheaper. I've never flown with Qantas domestically. And they have a completely separate terminal just for Qantas by themselves. They're so exclusive, I never realised. And so I'm like, okay, I've got to dash across. It's close by, but I've got to dash out. I run across to the other terminal, but then I've got to go through security again. By this time I've got 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes before boarding. So I'm quickly running through. The line's long. I'm trying to get ready, so I'm get my belt off already, I've got my shoes off, I've got my hair gel out, I've got my keys out. I'm trying to get everything ready, but then my pants are falling down and I'm dropping things and I'm so panicking. I'm run. I get through. They let me through. No alarms this time. I get through and I've just managed to make it onto the plane. Now, see, everyone knows you go to the airport to catch a plane. Right? That's the purpose of going to the airport. But the security keeps holding you back. It makes it hard for me to get on my plane because the security, there's so many requirements and so many security checks that it makes it hard for me to get on my plane. And that's what the tabernacle was like in the Old Covenant. That was the place where you were meant to go to meet God. That was the purpose of the tabernacle, to go and meet God and to worship God. And yet, everything that was set up in the tabernacle held you back. The sacrifices, the laws, the priests, the offerings, it kept holding you back because you couldn't meet the requirements. It made it hard for you to meet with God. Now, of course, the problem wasn't with the tabernacle. The problem wasn't with the rules. The problem was with the people. The problem was with you, with me. We were the problem. See, our hearts are not clean and we can't come before God. We can't come and meet God in the tabernacle. And verse 9 says, that the gifts and the sacrifices being offered, they were not able to clear our consciences. See, the sacrifices of the animals and goats, they deal with the external. Right? But the problem was internal. It was a problem with our hearts that the animals and the sacrifices couldn't deal with. So that was the old covenant. But now look at what Jesus does in the new covenant. Look at what Jesus brings in verse 11. When Christ came as a high priest of the good things that are already here, he went through the greater, a more perfect tabernacle that is not man-made, that is to say, not a part of this creation. He did not enter by means of the blood of goats and calves, but he entered the most holy place once for all by his own blood, having obtained eternal redemption. You see the difference when Jesus comes? He comes as a high priest, but he doesn't come to an earthly tabernacle. He doesn't come to a dummy version. He doesn't come to the imitation, but he goes through the real thing. Not just the symbol, but he goes actually into the very presence of God. And his boarding pass, which lets him in, is not the blood of goats and animals, but it's by his own blood that he enters. See, the writer of Hebrews is at pains to show us that Jesus is the real deal here. But he is the real high priest. The other high priests, they were just imitations. Jesus is going to the real tabernacle, not a man-made tabernacle. Jesus offers the real sacrifice, the sacrifice of his blood. And so because Jesus is the real thing, therefore the results of his ministry is real as well. Have a look in verse 13. So the blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer sprinkled on those who are ceremonially unclean sanctify them so that they are outwardly clean. How much more then will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciences from acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God. So you remember the problem with the animal sacrifices in verse 9? The problem was that they were limited in what they could do. They could not cleanse our conscience. They could do the external only, but not the internal. But the blood of Christ can cleanse our conscience from the acts that lead to death. See, the blood of Christ is the only thing that can deal with our hearts. It's the only thing that can deal with what we are internally like. And that leads me to my final point. See, the writer of Hebrews elaborates for quite a lengthy bit on this. See, because Jesus' priesthood is the real deal, his ministry is actually the only ministry that is effective. So look at how this is repeatedly emphasized in the passage. Have a look, verse 24, chapter 9, verse 24. For Christ did not enter a man-made sanctuary that was only a copy of the true one. He entered heaven itself, now to appear for us in God's presence. Nor did he enter heaven to offer himself again and again, the way high priests enter the most holy place every year with blood that is not his own. then Christ would have had to suffer many times since the creation of the world. But now he has appeared once for all at the end of the age to do away with sin by the sacrifice of himself. Just as man is destined to die once and after that to face judgment, so Christ was sacrificed once to take away the sins of many people. He will appear a second time, not to bear sin, but to bring salvation to those who are waiting for him. I don't know if you picked up on the repetition there. See, Jesus doesn't do it again and again. He doesn't do it every year. He doesn't suffer many times, but he does it once for all. Once for all. He was sacrificed once, and he has done away with sin. He's finished with sin. So the very fact that you have to do something again and again, it means that the first time you're doing it, you weren't very good at it. So I have a 2-year-old son, Jake, at the moment, and he likes to help out with our household chores. Now you might think that's fantastic. I'm training him to do household chores. So he'll help us do vacuuming. He'll want to help us wash the dishes. And you think, wow, that's great. I can't get my teenage kids to do it, but I've got a 2-year-old who's willing to do housework. But it's not that simple, you see. It sounds really good. But so with him helping, everything takes about 3-4 times as long. See, we're trying to vacuum, and he wants to grab the vacuum cleaner. But he doesn't know where to push it. He just kind of randomly goes everywhere, and he knocks things over, and he bumps into things, and then he gives up after he gets bored after a while. He tries to help us wash the dishes, so I might wash, and I'll put it in the sink to rinse. But he'll play with the water, he'll splash around, he'll get water everywhere. Then, and then he'll pick up the dishes, and they've still got soap on them, and he'll put it in the rack. And I'm like, no, that's not clean. You've got to bring it back. You've got to rinse it properly. And then he'll chuck it back into my sink where the soapy water is. And so it's not very effective doing dishes with him. Everything takes much longer. And the thing is, though, even if I'm doing the chores by myself, even if I tell them bugger off, I don't get any help, it's still not very effective doing housework, because you have to do it again and again and again, don't you? See, how good would it be if you only had to do housework once and that's it? How good would it be if you just did it once and you don't have to ever do it again? See, there are products in the supermarket that tell you, if you use their products, it will speed up your house chores. It will make it less hard work. Maybe you don't have to do it as frequently. You spray on, wipe, and it's done. Or you do it once and then you don't have to do it again for another 4 weeks. There are products that will try and make things easier for you. But you still have to do it again and again and again. See, if you could create a product that would clean once for all, everyone would want to buy that product. Well, Jesus here, he does it once for all. Not again and again and again, but he does it one time. And that's it, never again. He was sacrificed once to take away the sins of many people. And it was effective. It did the job. So have a look in verse 11. He compares Jesus' priesthood to the ordinary priest. Day after day, every priest stands and performs his religious duties. Again and again, he offers the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins. So when this priest, Jesus, had offered for all time one sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God. Since that time, he waited for his enemies to be made his footstool, because by one sacrifice, he had made perfect forever those who are being made holy. See the contrast? Jesus does it once, and then he's seated. So when do you sit down? You don't sit down when you're doing house chores, right? You're on your feet, you're moving around, you're walking, you're wiping. The only time you sit down is when you finish your housework. Then you get to sit down, you put your feet up, you have a cup of tea. See, when the Bible says Jesus sat down at the right hand of God, it means it's finished. He's finished his work. He has nothing left to do. He's finished, and so he can sit back and relax. So Jesus gets the job done. See, and that's why on the cross, when Jesus was dying, he says, it is finished. There is never again a need for another sacrifice. There is never again a need for another temple, for another priest. It is finished. Jesus does it one time. Whereas the other priests did it for thousands of years. They did it again and again and again, every day, every year. But Jesus does it once, and he gets the job done. So what have we looked at this morning? We're trying to understand what it means for Jesus to be a high priest, not just any high priest, but a high priest in the order of Melchizedek. And we learned 3 things today. We said that Jesus is the permanent high priest because he lives forever. We said secondly that Jesus is the heavenly high priest because he serves in the heavenly tabernacle. And thirdly, we saw that Jesus is the effective high priest because he does it once and it's finished. Now, if you've been with us here for the last couple of weeks, it's taken us 9.5 or 10 chapters to get to this point. And really, it's been a massive argument that the author has been building up to this point. He's been adding to the understanding of Jesus each passage from week to week to get us to this point. And right at this point, there are some massive implications. Right? Now that we understand who Jesus is, there are some massive things that he wants us to understand, particularly things that would affect how we live our Christian lives. I think there are particularly 3 things that he wants to highlight for us, 3 things that will potentially hold us back in our Christian life, and 3 things that how we can deal with it if we have Jesus as our high priest. So have a look in verse 19. He said, therefore, brothers, after 9.5 chapters, therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the most holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way opened for us through the curtain, that is his body, and since we have a great priest over the house of God. That's his summary for the last 9 chapters. Therefore, let us draw near to God with a sincere heart, in full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled to cleanse us from a guilty conscience, and having our bodies washed with pure water. It says, therefore, so we have a great high priest. What should we do? We should draw near to God. So I think that one of the things that holds us back as Christians, that stops us from growing as Christians, is often the sin and the temptation that's in our lives. They're the things that draw us away from God. And, there are times when, there are times in my Christian life I feel like God seems very distant. I feel like God is not there. I feel like, God, where are you? Why don't you say something? Why don't you do something? Why don't you reveal yourself? And I feel like sometimes I'm very distant from Him. It's usually when I've been disobedient, when I've been sinful, and I feel ashamed. And so at times like this, the Bible reminds us that it's not that God is far away from us. God hasn't moved away from us because of our sin. He hasn't turned away from us, but it's because we've turned away from Him. We're the ones who've moved away from God. As the author of Hebrews tells us to draw near to God, come back near to God. It's not that God has moved away, but you need to come back to God. And this idea of drawing near to God, it's a very, very intimate kind of term. It's hugging someone, it's putting your arms around them. It's a very intimate term. Draw near to God. I don't know if you realize how amazing it is that we can draw near to God. So that was what the Israelites could not do in the tabernacle. They could not come near to God. Everything said, keep out. Do not come in. You cannot enter the most holy place. And yet, the author of Hebrews says, come near. Draw near to God. It's all because Jesus has opened the way for us. Because Jesus is our great high priest. Because Jesus has cleansed our hearts. Because our bodies has been washed. It's our whole person, both in and out. We have been washed clean. And so we can draw near to God. That is something that for thousands of years, Israelites were longing for, that they were looking forward to, and yet we have it now. See, and I think as Christians, we need to keep coming back to this good news. This is the gospel that we believe in. What Jesus has done for us in His death and resurrection, in His role as a high priest, the things that He has achieved for us, we need to keep coming back to that. When we have doubts, when we have struggled with sin, when we fall to temptation, we've got to keep coming back to that. Rather than listening to our own sense of shame or guilt, but we need to come back and look to Jesus as one who cleanses us, who allows us to come into God. So I think another thing that might hold us back in our faith is perhaps times of testing, times of doubt. Doubt could perhaps be caused by times of suffering, or perhaps doubts caused by non-Christians and their values or questions that they've raised. And there are times in our lives where I think Christianity doesn't seem to make sense. Christianity doesn't have the answers that we're looking for. Our friends seem to be asking us so many difficult things and we don't know how to answer them. Or it seems like the world seems to make more sense. We don't understand what the Bible's saying, or we don't understand why God is doing something. And so we have doubts. And I think the temptation is to go look for answers elsewhere, away from the Bible. We go to our friends, we go to Google, we go to society, we look at what other people do. And the author of Hebrews says in verse 23, let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, for He who promised is faithful. So when we're being tested, the temptation is to think that God is not faithful, that God doesn't have the answers, that God cannot do anything about it. And so we turn elsewhere. we swerve in our faith. We swerve to everything else except God. We say, no, come to God. Hold unswervingly to Him. Hold on to Him when things are rocky, things are difficult. Hold on. And thirdly, see, these things, He's not telling us to do it by ourselves. We're not to hold unswervingly by ourselves and cling on, by our bare knuckles. He's not saying that we need to draw into God by ourselves, but it's something that we should do for each other. So have a look in verse 24. Let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds. Let us not give up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing. Let us encourage one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. See, he's got this idea of spurring one another on. As you know, a spur is what cowboys have on the back of their boots, and they use the kick into the horses to make them run faster. That's a spur on the back of the boot, right? And he's saying we need to spur each other on. So think about it. Spurring is not something you do to yourself. You don't kick yourself in the butt, right, with your spurs. You kick the horse, right? You don't kick yourself. You kick the horse. So spurring is something you do to other people, other things, other animals, or to other people, and other people do to you. So spur one another on. Spur each other on. Spur the people on around you. And perhaps it might mean give them a kick up the bum. Right? Give them a kick to wake them up. Get them going. If they've been a bit sluggish, a bit immature, a bit lazy in the Christian faith, give them a kick and get them moving. Back in 1904, the great magician Houdini, he's well known as a magician, but particularly for his feats as an escape artist. He would get himself in straitjackets, in handcuffs, and locked in boxes, and he would manage to get out of them somehow. But back in 1904, there was a contest by one of the local newspapers in London. And they gave this contest, they crafted this contest particularly for Houdini. They gave him this complex handcuff that they crafted with 6 locks on each cuff, 9 tumblers on each lock, which means a very complicated lock. Okay, so and he took up that challenge to get himself out of these handcuffs. So there were thousands of people gathered at the London Hippodrome to see if he could escape these new handcuffs. So they secured him, make sure it was all locked properly, and he went down into a box. And so you couldn't see what he was doing, right? You can't reveal his tricks. So he went down into the box, and everyone's just watching, some wiggling within the box, but they can't see what's going on. And he's there for 20 minutes. They can't see what's going on. 20 minutes, he's in a box, and they're wondering, can he do it? Can he get out? And 20 minutes later, he pops out of the box, and everyone starts clapping. They think, all right, he's out. And they realize, hang on, no, he's still got the handcuffs on. And Houdini just smiled and he just said, give me some light. He needs some light in the box. It was getting a bit dark in there. He goes back down into the box. And then again, he's working away. You can't see what he's doing. Another 15 minutes goes past. He's working, right? Once again, he pops up. Everyone starts clapping. But then he needs to stretch his knees. He was a bit cramped in there. He hasn't got him out yet. So he pops back down again. He's again struggling, working at it. Another 20 minutes go past. So this is almost an hour at this stage. But another 20 minutes goes past. He pops out of the box again. And this time the crowd doesn't clap yet. They kind of, just wait, just to check what's going on. He hasn't got out yet. He took off his jacket. He got a pocket knife out of his pocket. In order to take off his jacket to cut it up, right, because his handcuffs are in the way. So he cut up his jacket. He was saying it's getting hot in there. And so he freed himself from the jacket, still in handcuffs. He pops back down again. And the crowd gave him a cheer, and he keeps going. And he keeps working at it for another 10 minutes. And finally, after 10 minutes, he pops out of the bag. He's free of the handcuffs. He comes out. Everyone gives him a clap, a standing ovation. Everyone thinks it's awesome. And a reporter comes up to him and asks him, why do you keep popping up out of the box? Couldn't you have just done it for a while? You're inside the box. Why do you keep popping out? He said, it was because he needed to hear the encouragement of the crowd. So you think about it, he's been going at it for over an hour altogether, and he needed to keep popping up out of the box every now and then just to hear the encouragement of the crowd, to spur him on to keep going. So this is someone this is his career. He's a master at escaping handcuffs and yet he still needed that encouragement. He still needed people to spur him on to keep going. How much more do we need the encouragement of our fellow brothers and sisters to spur us on? So there may be people here right now, sitting here amongst us, People who are weighed down and burdened by sin. People who need a word of rebuke, perhaps. People who need a reminder of the gospel, that it is Jesus who opens the way for us to God. Not that we have to work ourselves there, not that we have to fix our lives, but it is Jesus who draws us near to God. Perhaps there are people who need to have some accountability, to open their lives with someone to help them walk through their struggles with sin and temptation. Or perhaps there are some of you here, sitting here, who are weighed down by expectation to look right, to act right in a certain way, to look religious, to come to church because you're supposed to, because you come from a Christian family. Maybe some of you here are faking your Christianity and you know it, but you don't know what else to do. You feel like you've got to keep up the appearances. You feel like you've got to look like you've got it all together. And perhaps you need someone who you can be open and honest with, who can share your doubts about Christianity, your apathy, someone who can give you a kick up the bum maybe. Perhaps there are people who are struggling with doubt, who are searching for answers to questions, and maybe they're going through a difficult time in their life, going through a difficult situation, and they need someone to walk with them in the time of darkness, to remind them of God's goodness and His faithfulness. Perhaps there are people here who are drifting away because of career, because of their studies. They're not able to commit to church or to Bible studies. They've got tutoring on, they've got part-time jobs, they've got work overtime, they've got family, and they are tempted to want to give up meeting together. They're tempted to do other things on a Sunday morning, on a Friday night, or whatever. They're tempted to put other priorities before God. So Hebrews encourages us to spur one another on, to help each other draw near to God, to help each other hold unswervingly to the hope that we have. See, there's no such thing as a Lone Range Christian. There's no such Christian who can grow by themselves. Christians are meant to be together. That's what a church is. A church is a gathering of Christians. A church is not the building. A church is the people coming together. So if you are a Christian who feels like you need other brothers and sisters, then I hope this is a good place for you to do that. I hope this is a place where you can find other brothers and sisters who can encourage you, who can rebuke you, who can give you a kick if needs be. I hope you can do that for other people as well. So as we think about this coming year, who are the people that you are spurring on in your life? Who are the people sitting here that you are going to focus on spurring? You can't spur on everyone here. There's 60, 70 people here. You're not going to be spurring everyone, but think of one or two people that you can spur on. And who are the people who are spurring you on? Who are the people who are encouraging you, who are keeping you accountable? If you don't have these kind of people, come and talk to me, come and talk to some of the leaders. Find these people who are able to help you keep going, because you can't do it by yourself. As a church then, let us spur one another on towards love and good deeds, because we have a great high priest. We have Jesus, the one who has opened the way for us to live in God, the one who has entered into heaven, the real tabernacle, and opened the way for us to God.